A social story is defined as both a process and a product. I think sometimes people mistakenly focus on the story, but there is a defined process that precedes and follows through the entire development and implementation of the story. What social stories do is they help to eliminate some of the common mistakes that I made as a teacher and that we as adults make when we communicate with children with a diagnosis of autism or autistic children. And so it sort of um, helps to eliminate that probability by um, changing not the behavior of the person with autism. Uh, in fact, we don't even use the term behavior, we use response, but to change the behavior of the adults who are attempting to develop the social story. It's like riding a bicycle. It's difficult at first, and then you do it without thinking after that, after some practice.
Is this something that parents can do for themselves, or do you need qualifications to write a social story?
I think parents write the very best social stories. And what was discovered in a study, I wish I could find the reference for it, in Australia, it was a study that I did look at and read several years ago, was they trained both parents and professionals to write a social story in a live workshop. This was in the 1990s, sent them all out for a year, had them come back, and then asked them to each bring a social story that they had recently written. What they discovered is that the parents were still following the criteria and following the processes, and their stories were genuine social stories at far more frequently than the professionals who had defaulted to what we often see referred to as a social story, but those of us on team social stories, we refer to those stories as scripts or as stories with a lowercase, but not as a social story. In fact, it's impossible to write a bad social story. It's impossible to write a good social story. If you follow the criteria, it will be safe and respectful for the audience, and that's what's most important.
What are the key things that you would put in a few sentences?
If I was a parent and I was handed a story, and it was, well, just a story, to determine if it was safe and respectful and likely to be effective with my child, I would ask questions like, how did you come up with the topic? I would ask questions or look for any word that reflects bias. For example, should, ought, should not. Anything that reflects or an attempt to direct the behavior or the response of the person receiving the story. The theory behind social stories is that we're sharing social information as accurately and safely as possible without bias. And then what the research has shown and what our experience has shown is that very often the person reads the story and comes up with their own response. It might not be our own, but it is consistent with their personality and consistent with how they perceive the situation, and it works. And that's what we want. That's the goal of social stories, is to, by sharing accurate information over time and through several stories, helping kids to identify the relevant factors in a situation, to read and interpret a situation more effectively, and to respond in their own way. Because that's what it means to be social.
Can you give some examples of how you use a social story? Maybe even the first examples where you came up with the idea.
The idea was the result of a conversation with a secondary student Eric, who I had worked with since he was 4 years old, and at this time he was right around 17, 18 years of age, where I discovered that his interpretation of what happened in an assembly was very, very different from my own. And it was shocking because he had interrupted the assembly. We had been working on interrupting with him since he was 4, when he was included in many general education classrooms. And it was often like he was having a conversation with the teacher. Whatever the teacher would say, he had a response for that. And we tried several behavioral interventions that were very positive and popular during the time. He would reassure me, Mrs. Gray. He never called me Carol, never called me Carol Gray. It was always, no, he always called me Carol Gray. That's right. And he would say, Carol Gray, I promise I will stop interrupting. And then he would go into the class and there it was, he would interrupt. And it was luckily recorded. We had a new videotape machine, and so I was just recording everything, and I recorded a conversation with him that where I discovered that, oh my goodness, he's doing exactly what I taught him to do at age 4, and that is when somebody talks to you, you answer. I forgot to teach him the relevance of the other people in the room, the fact that context is critically important to being social. And as a result, I began writing social stories, turned around and realized, okay, I've made a mistake for 15 years with this young man. I'm not going to continue that mistake. I have to do things differently.
What do you think is the most common scenario where they're used today?
Probably the most common scenario that people write stories, not social stories, is there's some difficulty, some challenge, some response that perhaps they don't fully understand. The one thing I've learned about us as parents and professionals, including myself early on, is that we're not real comfortable with being confused. We're not real comfortable with not knowing what to do. And we have a tendency to share maybe here's what happened here, here's what happened there. Yeah, I'm having a problem with it too. And then somebody after, 40 minutes will hit the table and say, well, what are we going to do? But they don't know what to do yet. There's nothing that has logically arisen. There hasn't been any information, any discovery that helps them to understand, what we have to do. What piece of information he's missing that we're picking up on is this. And so here's what we can do. And here's the information that we can share. The social story process now, as of about 1.5 years ago, the emphasis is, let's not write so many social stories. Let's gather information until we discover, hopefully, an alternate solution.
Are there times when you think it's really not a good time to do a social story? Are there particular situations where you think, oh, absolutely, a social story is not the right thing for that?
I would say anytime somebody mentions a behavior and somebody says, well, let's write a social story to discourage him from doing that. Number one, they're not going to write a social story, and that would be definitely not the time to write that story. You need to gather information first, and you need to discover, as a result of Social Stories 10.4, you need to make sure that an alternate solution may not be the best solution. So I would think anytime your focus is on the behavior instead of on understanding the perspective and the information that your audience currently has, that's not the time to write a social story. You're going to go down the wrong path.
Oh, I want to ask you about the I questions, because that was, for me, that was a big eye opener, and why you should always have I statements or we statements and never you statements.
Second person statements, what we discovered in practice and from stories that were sent to us very early on was that the you statements tend to harbor our assumptions, and you should. You may want, or more positively stated, you may want to say hello when your teacher enters the room, or you may want to Or you may find that, but bottom line, it's not helpful because I can't think of anybody who likes to be told what to do. And so I'm not going to, for some reason, assume that a person who is autistic would want to be told what to do. That would be silly. And so, but I can share, here is what it looks like to me. And, you know, I'm ready to affirm how it looks to you. It's valid. How it looks to you is valid.
Do you have a favorite story of a social story helping a child?
Many parents and professionals of especially preschoolers, even children in kindergarten, have shared that he comes home from preschool, he comes home from kindergarten. I kneel down and I say, tell me about your day, tell me what you did, and there's nothing. And the same occurs as it goes from school to home. In the late 1990s, there wasn't a lot happening online yet, not like there is today. And so kids, young children would travel with a little notebook back and forth, and mom and dad would write what happened at night, and then they'd send it off to school, and then the teacher would write back. So we had a little guy who, when mom knelt down or when the teacher knelt down and said, tell me about your day, nothing. You know, whereas other kids will, oh, I did this, I did that, I did that. So I gathered information, and a huge part of of the process is to gather information without bias, without thinking that you know the answer in any way, shape, or form, that you're comfortable just gathering information as objectively as you can. And I talked to everyone, and it occurred to me, oh, I thought I talked to everyone, but I didn't talk to the bus driver. So I talked to the bus driver, who said, well, you know what this little guy does is he could read way ahead of his age group, but he was great at reading. And so on the way to school, he was reading what his parents had written about what he did the night before. And on the way home, he was reading. So it didn't make any sense to him, because I had a theory anyway. I bet it doesn't make any sense to him. The teacher reads what he did last night, and then she says, tell me what you did last night. Why would you do that? So we developed, I had been gathering information thinking I was going to write a social story, and then it occurred to me, no, the solution is more comprehensive than that. We want this little guy to be sharing information cross context for the rest of his life. It will protect him from bullying. This is critical. So what we did was we developed an approach called the garbage book, and it was published in Carol's Club on my website, which is absolutely free, and it's there on September 3rd, 2019, I reprinted it with some additional insights in terms of how important I think the garbage book is. So it is my favorite social story product, but it was an alternate solution. And we did not need to write a social story. I suppose we could have. We could at the end of the year, applauded him for all of the different things that he had shared between home and school. What's central and most important with the garbage book is that parents and professionals do not share information that is in the garbage book. So each night, each school night, a piece of representative garbage is selected. For example, if they go to McDonald's, they take the McDonald's French fry wrapper, they put that in as a black bag, put that into the book, off it goes. And the only person on the planet who can enlighten the teacher as to what that is all about is the child. And then they open the book and they go, tell me about this. We've used it even with children who are not yet verbal. And whatever that child does, if they smile, if they frown, that is then recorded by the teacher to physically demonstrate, look, what you're saying is important to me and I'm recording it here. And then same thing on the way home from school. a crayon stub, or there's an activity that the child really enjoyed and had fun, we take a sample or a photo and put it and send it home, and then tell me about this. What we've discovered with that approach is the reports get longer and longer and more detailed as time goes on. So that is my very favorite because it is a very powerful strategy and an important strategy in my book. Sometimes the results are just so shocking. I think when a child demonstrates an intense response, I know that myself as a teacher, I used to assume that the solution would be something that was quite involved and quite inspired and quite, when what social stories have taught me is no, abandon all assumptions. The most intense responses have been basically they disappear when the social story hits the nail on the head.